Hello and welcome to another episode of Steelfur Speaks with, of course, me, Steelfur, aka Finbar Begley, UK-based flesh and blood player. I'm excited to be here speaking again. The topic of today's video is not the fact that I have recently shaved off my beard. It is the sort of heroes that you are going to be facing at the Road to Nationals if you get into the top 8 or I especially if you want to call that out, like you can face anything in Swiss, right? But when you're talking about the top eights, you're talking about more consistent performers. You're talking about the higher tier decks, and we are in this fantastic place at the moment with the game where the balance is genuinely fantastic. We've seen 8 or 9 different heroes all win Road to Nationals. We've seen different heroes making top 8s. Every single local meta is varied and different, partly based on what legendaries people have opened and what their collection has available for them to do, but also based on what people think is strong and what people are struggling to put together and build as decks. And that's why you see some shops having a lot of Bravo and some shops having a lot of Chane. I mean, Chane is everywhere, but if you look at the breakdowns, different regions are showing different heroes, and that is really, really exciting. So we're going to start off. We're doing this kind of alphabetically. There are 9 decks. I won't say heroes. There are 9 decks that I feel are suitably strong to, we'll say, consistently make. Well, maybe not even consistently, but basically, if you're facing against these in the top 8, I wouldn't be surprised. And those are, in alphabetical order, Bolton, of course, Bravo, Chane, Dash, Dorinthia, Katsu Aggro, Katsu Control, Prism, and Rhinar. And I guess Sonata Viserai could potentially find a place there, but I'm less certain on that outside of 1 or 2 tournaments where it has done very well. I've played against a lot of Viserai myself, and it really has that feeling of sort of B tier can have its day, but not really consistently delivering. But then Rhino might fall into the same category, so maybe we'll add in Viserai when we get to part 2 of this video. So part 1 of this video is looking at the first 5 heroes on that list. So this video will be Bolton, Bravo, Chane, Dorinthia, and Dash. I have a deck list for all of them, just taken from FabDB, which kind of lines up with what I personally have seen people playing, heard about people winning with, and I'm going to kind of talk to you through what how each of these decks work, what your signs are, sort of how you need to play against them. Obviously, these are highly matchup dependent, so use these ideas as discussion points and jumping off points for your own thoughts on what is good and how you're going to make your deck work to it. Don't just use this as a Bible, that Steelfur said I need to play aggro into Dash, so I have to play aggro into Dash. There's lots of nuance in this game in different matchups, but I want this video to sort of be a primer to take sort of, let's say, the sting off your first match against each of these heroes when you're trying to figure out what they do, how to deal with it, and what their sort of game plan is going to be. So each of these heroes, we're going to discuss their basic abilities and their main threats. We're going to talk about their rough game plan, and we're going to talk about sort of their primary strategy and how they approach the game. So by the end of this video and the second part, you should have a good understanding of the general field, and when you pull up against one of these heroes, you're going to know roughly what their goals are and how you're going to fight them and what their main thing is. So let's start with Bolton. The Bolton's ability, those of you who don't know, obviously if you've charged this turn and your opponent blocks with an attack action, your attack gets +1, which lets you use the attack reaction to banish a card from his soul to give something greater. So if you block one of his attacks with an attack action, you do enable this attack reaction. Okay, as long as he has charged. What that means, sometimes, if you're playing aggro, there are good opportunities to not block Bolton in order to not turn on his secondary effect, in order to not give him the benefit of the go again. However, Bolton is smart about this, and that is why you will see a lot of cards like Courageous Steelhand, Luminous Ascension, V for the Vanguard, and other ways that he can buff his own attacks so he isn't relying on you blocking in a specific way. So that's the first sort of bit about Bolton, is to understand that there are going to be times when you don't block him in order to stop him giving himself go again, but there are going to be plenty of times where that is going to lead to a combat trick or a buff that he's going to put on himself so that he can just get that free go again, including his weapon, which of course, if he is charged, gets +3 by default and therefore can always give itself go again. His equipment setup is usually fairly straightforward. Tunic for some go again, for some resources, Braveforge braces for armor, and occasionally you can use it with a Luminous Ascension to get +1 on Raiden, Skullcap for armor, and a little bit of Arcane Barrier against Viscerite if it's switched on, Scalers to get go again. His main threats that you kind of need to be aware of, I guess, Take Flight is a big one because it just gives go again and lets him charge. Take Flight into Valiant Thrust is a really powerful combo because you can Take Flight into Valiant Thrust, banish to give Valiant Thrust go again, and then hit with Raiden. So you kind of got that 4-7-3 damage profile, which is kind of rough to block. Any of his charge abilities, of course, can turn on something like Courageous Steel Hand to get a buff. He does like to build up his soul and turn into something like Celestial Cataclysm or use a very powerful Beacon of Victory. Beacon of Victory is this fantastic card. If he has a big soul, you need to be very, very aware of how many cards he has in his soul. And for example, if you're on, say, 10 life and he has 7 cards in his soul and he comes in for 3, be very wary of the fact that Beacon of Victory can just straight up kill you if he chooses to banish all 7. Whether or not he does or doesn't will depend on whether or not he thinks you have defense reactions. If he knows you're not running them, for example, you're playing Chane or something like that, he will very happily just banish the 7 and take lethal. So you need to watch and be aware for that. He can also search his deck for an action card with cost X or less. This really can be anything. It can be a Lumina to Arsenal for next turn. It can be something like a Celestial Cataclysm, maybe if he doesn't banish that many cards, so he could give +1 with Beacon of Victory and then come in with a Celestial Cataclysm. It could be something like an Illuminate just to chuck on as an additional attack and get 4. So there's loads of different options for something like Beacon of Victory. It's also just worth being aware of Bolting Blade. If he has charged twice or even once on the turn and has another card in hand, he may be able to pitch and play this for another 7. Bolton is really good against certain heroes in the meta, people like Prism. He's quite good at. He has a decent matchup against other aggro decks like Chane and Katsu, just because he can sometimes race them. And you'll see that his deck has a lot of flex slots, like things you can sideboard in, like energy potions, like soul shields, like defense reactions, like Steelblade Shunts, just to get you a bit more defense for certain matchups, like say Dorinthia and things like that, where you need to kind of block a bit more. So that's kind of a light primer on Bolton. Typically, the thing that you need to know about Bolton is that he is very hand reliant. So he needs to have a card to charge. Often, unless he has one of his 0 costs, and there's a reason that he plays all these 0 costs, he needs to have a card to pitch as well as a card to charge. So that's 3 cards. And then if he wants to put a second threat on the table that isn't just a Raiden swing, he needs to have 4 cards. So the times to be aware of Bolton is when he isn't blocking you. So if Bolton has a card in Arsenal, 4 cards in hand, and chooses not to block anything, you should throw as much damage as you can at him, because he is likely not going to block in favor of a much more aggressive turn, which gives you the ability as another player with damage options to basically say, look, how much are you going to take? And if you get him to the point, for example, where you can kill him and you're presenting lethal, then he has to block. And suddenly that big turn that he was saving up and taking lots of damage for doesn't get realized. So it's well aware of trying to read Bolton's tells. And Bolton's tells are not blocking, like keeping the full hand, and having a tunic token on his tunic. So if he has a token on his tunic, he can actually pay for the majority of these cards that charge. So he can pay for things like Take Flight, and he can pay for things like Steelblade Shunt, and cross the line. And that gives him a lot more reach than he would have without the Tunic token. So once he has that Tunic token, you can expect something like a big V for Vanguard or a Take Flight turn, or something quite large like that. Because like Take Flight, for example, into Luminar Ascension with a Tunic counter means that he doesn't need, so he can block with one card in hand, or two if he has a Luminar in Arsenal, and still come in with quite a significant turn where he goes Take Flight, Luminar, double Raiden for 4 and 4, and maybe gain some life and do some good damage. Similarly, if he has a Tunic counter and he has a full hand with V of the Vanguard, he can charge 3 times and then come in with a Raiden for 6. Obviously, Lumina and V together can make a pretty potent combo as long as he has that Tunic counter. So that's just something to be worth keeping an eye on versus Bolton. He is very aggressive. If you can get him into a position where he is blocking, then you will have a much more like strong game against him, because essentially he needs those cards in hand. He is explosive, but against slower decks, you can expect to see things like Celestial Cataclysm coming in for more setup. Against Prism, obviously, you bring in the Bolting Blades as well, so you can have plenty of 6 cost to break her stuff with. And that's kind of really just a light summary of Bolton. So moving, and I've played Bolton a bit, so I think he's quite a good deck. I haven't taken him to a proper event yet, but I think he's just quite fun, quite aggressive, and obviously we've seen Bolton winning with lists similar to this in various Road to Nationals and things like that. So that is Bolton. Moving on then to Bravo. This obviously is a deck that won first place at the Road to Nationals. It's kind of similar to other versions that I have seen being played, with the ability to sideboard in stuff like Zealous Belting versus aggro, side in things like Snag as well, and then offer just sort of much more threat, plenty of defense reactions as well, just to play a slower, more control-y game where you're smashing with the hammer every turn. So Bravo, his main ability is pitch 2, and to the end of your turn, your attacks with cost 3 or greater gain dominate. Go again. Right, now, it's important to understand that to activate this and pay for a card that costs 3 or greater, Bravo needs to have 5 pitch, which will be 2 cards minimum. So in order for Bravo to come in with a big attack plus dominate, he's going to need to have at least 2 cards to pitch, and that is assuming the card costs 4. If the card costs 5, for example, or 7, he's going to need even more pitch to get off his really powerful attacks. So again, like we saw with Bolton, if Bravo is not blocking and taking a lot of damage, you should be looking for, expecting even, a dominated Crippling Crush or a dominated Spinal Crush to come at you on the next turn, especially if he has a token from Tectonic Plating. So let's talk through this a bit more, just so people know. So Bravo's main threat in many games is just Anathos. He'll pitch a 3, he'll swing for 4, he'll block, and then he'll keep a card and then swing for 4 again. And you take the damage because it's only 4 and you want to try and break through his defense. But then that adds up and then you find yourself on very low life dealing with something like a Crippling Crush. His equipment, Skullcap. People also do play Helm of Iceland's Peak, which is the one that lets you get +1 intellect that turn, just to help you sort of build up to a bigger turn. Crater Fist is often played for the defense. I have never really seen the ability used that often, but it could be. Major Master Boots is played. Iron Rot Boots is played because Bravo doesn't have a good pair of shoes, which may get fixed in Aria with the new Guardian. A bit of Null Rune because it's really hard for Guardian to go up against Viserai or Chane without Null Rune, because Guardian likes a slower game, and being able to block the arcane damage with all these blues is actually very favourable for for Bravo. Tectonic Plating creates a Seismic Surge token, and what Seismic Surge does is make the first attack you play on your next turn -1 cost, so you can begin to see the power of setting up to, say, a Crippling Crush for 6, where it's only 2 pitch versus 3. A Spinal Crush for 4, where it's only 2 pitch instead of 3 again, and leaves you more room to fit in the dominate effects. So really, Bravo players love to arsenal one of these big attacks and swing in with the tectonic plating. And the use of the arsenal as well is very important. So if you are playing something like Command and Conquer, and you're not sideboarding it in against that many people, like for example in my aggro Katsu deck, you might put them in against Bravo because it really does force them to block in, quite heavily. And if, for example, you can bait out their blocks earlier with, say, a leg tap that they have to block, and then you can do a rising knee thrust, which they might block, and then you command and conquer, then suddenly you have probably hit their arsenal, which will both waste the tectonic plating turn that they've set up, but also maybe get rid of a crippling crush or a threat. So those being the main threats that come against you from Bravo is these big attacks. They may come at you with one of these other crush effects. Cranial Crush is quite good. Crush the Weak. A lot of these are here to pitch. But the ones that cost 3 or 4, Bravo is more than happy to chuck out on a good turn. He does often set up a bit with Showtime, things like Towering Titan, which give his next attack scary amounts of damage. But they do take a turn to set up, so, if you're playing many decks, you can kind of go into them with that idea. Rouse the Ancients as well as a new addition, just because if you've got a handful of attacks, you can get 7 in and go again. And, Bravo is very much trying to start teching for the aggro meta by adding in some go again, because there's nothing that someone like Chane or Katsu hates more than having to take, say, 14 damage from 2 different attacks on one turn. Crippling Crush and Spinal Crush are like death blows to those decks anyway if they hit too often. But, they can be played around. I will say that, like, as an aggro player, there are some times when you just have to trust your hand and take the 11 damage and just see what you're left with. Same with Spinal Crush. There will be times when you have buffs and you can just let the Spinal Crush hit and just try and hit for as much damage with, say, like, an E-Strike buffed with a Razor Reflex or something like that, just to try and keep the pressure up without relying on go again. And they are hard, and sometimes your Bravo opponent won't see them, and sometimes they won't be able to play them. Other cards, so Righteous Cleansing is becoming quite interesting. People are playing that to sort of attack Chane, because if you can play it and then hit someone's Art of Wars, for example, you can banish them from the deck. Or banishing a lot of attack actions late game where they don't have that much go again. You could give them a big turn, but you could also just really screw up their turn. Remembrance for the late games. There's lots of nuance here on the sideboard as well. For example, some matchups might see you take out some defense reactions or take out the Zealous Beltings in favor of more defense reactions, running Snag to shut down Chane, Stamp Authority to stop on hit effects, for example. Ooh! Oh, sorry. No, it's getting late today. But I wanted to do this video because it's been on my mind for the past days, so I'm trying to get this recorded. So that's kind of a good summary of Bravo. I find him to be a very straightforward hero. He's going to hit you with the big attacks. He's going to try and set up. You can kind of see when and where he's setting up, and you can, to a certain extent, if you have your own defense reactions, prepare for it. And that can be a good strategy to do just to make sure these crush effects don't hit you. But in general, he's going to just play a slower game where he's building up a tectonic plate every return. He's going to come in with a specific threat that you're going to have to deal with. He's going to, get his Towering Titan. He's going to get his Stamp Authority. They'll often, and it's quite funny, so if Bravo's going second, they'll actually often take out the Towering Titan, just so they don't, because if they go first, they can get a free Towering Titan on turn 1. Which is really scary, and sometimes they'll just take it out if they're going second. Yeah, so I will say, getting reps against Bravo is quite good, just in terms of feeling these crusher effects hitting, because when you're a new player going into them, they do feel very scary, especially if they get dominated. The reality is in CC, you do have enough HP to take a few of them, and just use that turn to slow down or set up or arsenal and not just lose the game because you got hit with a crippling crush. So like if this is dominated, it is fine to just block it for 2 or 3, take 8, and then just use that turn with whatever you've got left, your 1 card to arsenal, and just build up to another turn. Like it does feel bad, but like if you watch a lot of games, you'll see one person taking a massive chunk of HP doesn't necessarily mean they lose. Often to get that person over the finish line, the control player or the player with the tempo has to take some damage in order to try and set up a kill turn, and if that kill turn doesn't work, then you have another opportunity to come back into the game, even though you were 11 health behind because of a crushed dominate. So that's it. Bravo. I mean, Bravo is really good, I think, especially just the ability to constantly push the hammer threat. And that's where a lot of the damage in the game is going to come from. It's just this 4 or 6 damage that you're not really going to want to block, but you probably should every now and then. So let's move on to the big bad. And obviously I have a whole video dedicated to Chane that I'm going to be updating with the latest things that have been learned from Chane deck building. Like, for example, Matt Rogers' variant that runs Flock of the Featherwalkers. I have tested that for about 10, 15 games. I do find Flock of the Featherwalkers is both brilliant but also more awkward. Combined with the Shadow Puppetry early game, it's fantastic. Using it obviously on a slower turn to set up a quicken token for a big turn is brilliant. However, there will be turns when you're sitting there and it's the last card in your hand and you're just like, I don't really want to be playing this. I don't really want to arsenal this other card just to get a quicken token. And it does get a bit awkward, but otherwise it is a 1 for 5. I think that is pretty strong. So it feels like it has a valid place in the deck. So Chane's ability for the uninitiated, you make a Soul Shackle, your next Runeblade or Shadow action this turn gets Go Again. That basically is all of your attacks, pretty much, including stuff like Ursa and things like that. So it's really useful. It also works on your weapon. The Soul Shackles then themselves banish the top card of your deck at the start of every turn, giving you that option to see what they do. The Shackles, they are kind of random earlier on in the game before you've done a lot of deck filtering. You can definitely banish your key cards like your Command and Conquers, your Enlightened Strikes, your Art of Wars when you don't want to. And there is a lot of, I would say, variance because of that in the Chane game. As you get later on into the deck, when you've pitched a lot more stuff that has Blood Debt, when you've set up and returned things to the bottom of your deck with Unhallowed Rites, which puts cards on the bottom of your deck, as long as they have Blood Debt and they're a non-attack action, you do get more consistent turns where every turn is banishing Blood Debt. And against control players, that's often how Chane plays, where he sort of sits down and he looks to build a good lower half of his deck and these very powerful turns where Riftbind gets plus tons of damage and they kind of smack through. I guess the main threats really to worry about is things like Riftbind. Riftbind will get plus X, where X is the number of non-attack actions you've played this turn. And late game, that can be a lot of these Seeds of Agony, Shadow Puppetries, Howl from Beyonds to get really big Riftbinds in there. People are running snags specifically to turn this off. Just remember that you have to play it in response to the Riftbind being played. And another thing to be very careful about is that whilst some of Chane's attacks do get bonuses regardless of where they are, so like for example, Rip Through Reality doesn't need to be played from the Banish Zone to get Go Again. Something like Riftbind absolutely does. You need to be make very, very sure that, and because this has happened to me in a tournament, is that your opponent, when they're playing Riftbind, it comes from the Banish Zone. They're not accidentally misrepresenting damage by thinking the ability is switched on, but they played it from their arsenal or their hand. It only works if it is played from the Banished Zone, and people often miss that if you do. The same is true for Bounding Demigon. If you don't play it from the Banished Zone, it doesn't get +1. So these are just little things to be aware of. Chane is pretty straightforward aggro. You do have a lot of cards you'll take out against other aggro matchups. You won't play, for example, Time Snap Potions or Energy Potion. You'll probably take out Unhallowed Rites Blue. You'll take out Eclipse. You'll take out Seeping Shadows. Against control, you put all of these in. Matt Rogers has a really good video where he talks through this deck specifically. But really, the Chane game plan is defend early when necessary, get shackles, do damage, and then get lots of shackles and just try and blow your opponent out of the water. If you are playing into Chane, you are not going to be able to entirely race them. And this new deck is much better at resisting fatigue if they correctly call that you're playing control, because they will put 74 cards in. So it really is a case of, in my opinion, putting enough pressure on the Chane player that they feel obligated to block, with on-hit effects, with crushes, with go again, that basically they feel like they're taking too much damage and they have to block. If you can get them low enough, early enough on, when they're on four or five shackles, or three or four or five shackles, to the point where they feel like they have to block to avoid losing, because they will be worried about going below 10 life when they have blood debt to worry about, then you're in a much more solid position. Because if you can take a couple of cards out of the Chane player's hand every turn, then you can really stop them from paying for the cards they get in their banish zone, and then they will build up, and Chane players will lose to banish. The main things to be aware of, though, in terms of when you're going to block and when the sort of big threats are coming in, is, of course, Art of War. They banish a card with Blood Debt. They give their cards +1/+1, and often they'll give their attacks go again. And when they play this, I mean, it's kind of an indicator that you're probably going to be looking at 3 or 4 attacks a turn. It is worth noting that most of Chane's attacks come in for 3 or 4 or 5. So outside of like the huge rift binds, you can kind of get a good understanding of what the maximum amount of damage a Chane player is likely to do to you in a particular turn, just based on the amount of cards they have, whether they have Snapdragon Scalers, whether they chose to get Go Again with Art of War, or they chose to get +1/+1, whether that's indicative of them having more Go Again or needing the Go Again from Art of War. You can kind of get used to this idea of a tempo where you're only going to take, say, 4 times 4 damage from 4 different attacks, or you're going to take 4 times 5 damage, so you might take 20 or something like that. And you can really get into an understanding of sort of looking at the board, reading your opponent's hand, how they've pitched and banished stuff, to get an idea of how many more attacks are coming in the Chane in terms of like when they shackled and all that kind of stuff. And if you can get good at reading that, then it's easy to be like, okay, well, I'm probably only going to take 8 more damage this turn, so I don't really need to go massively into the defensive. If they're only going to deal me 8 damage, I can take that 8. And, you know, you can really get a good read on Chane in terms of how much damage they're going to deal to you. Sometimes you'll be wrong. They'll just throw out a random command and conquer at the end of the Chane, and you'll just be like, how the hell do I deal with this? But a lot of the time, you're actually going to get that ability to sort of predict how much damage Chane is going to do to you, just based on their pitch and stuff. And if you can keep the pressure on, you can make Chane less go. The worst thing you can do, I think, which is why a lot of control decks have been suffering, is just let Chane attack you. And the fatigue strategy is becoming much worse against Chane as he's kind of adapting to it and building into these bigger turns that you can't really stop. So that's just worth considering. And that's Chane. I think Chane is fantastic. You're going to see multiple Chanes in every top 8 you come into. If I was to say, you know, for every tournament series, there is one hero who you have to beat because he's going to be everywhere. And that's the hero that you test every new deck against just to make sure it can beat it. So I would say this is that if you're building a new deck and it's a Levia or an Azalea or a Bolton or whatever, get some games in versus your local Chane player. Just get 5 or 6 games in. See if your deck has legs. See if your deck can take Chane down. And if you can't, then it's probably not the best deck to be bringing to a road to Nationals at the moment, just because of the amount of Chane you're going to see. And that is just a reality of it. Because you might do well in the Swiss, but then you'll run into Chanes in the top 8. All the road to Nationals I've been to have had at least 2 or 3 Chanes in the top 8. And that is just something to be aware of, that you can't like dodge Chane all day. At one road to Nationals I played 4 Chane matches in a row, which obviously I won, but you know, it was close games, and obviously you're just going to have Chane. So I will say, out of all of these decks, if there was one hero I would say, if you're prepping for road to Nationals, your deck has to be able to beat, it is Chane. And that is something I think you just need to be aware of from the very start when you're picking a hero. And one of the reasons that all the heroes we're talking about are making this list is that they have, at least if not an advantaged, an average or, you know, slightly subpar game versus Chane, right? Everyone we've talked about so far, Bravo can fatigue Chane, Bravo can threaten Chane with crush effects that Chane really feels like he has to block. A good spinal crush or crippling crush can really hurt Chane. Therefore, Bravo is a good threat for Chane. Dash is an interesting one because they can defend quite a lot, but they can also threaten a lot of damage. We'll get onto Dash in a minute. Bolton is the same. They can threaten a lot of damage. They have on-hit effects, which makes Chane more likely to want to defend. And by putting on that pressure through the on-hit and everything, you can get Chane players down. The same with Aggro Katsu, full of on-hit effects that Chane isn't going to want to block, but if he doesn't block them, then Aggro Katsu will just tear into pieces. So a lot of the champions you see in this list are the ones creating threats by making those on-hit effects, by adding the pressure, and making Chane not play his own waiting game where it's just like, oh, well, I'm on the 6 shackles now, and I banish, therefore I win because I banished all my Seeds of Agony to Giant Riftbind. But by saying, okay, well, I'm on 4 shackles now and I'm already on 10 life, how do I actually deal with this? What is my game plan? What happens if I can't kill them this turn? Oh, I'm dying to Blood Deck. You know, there's all the things where you have to put the pressure on Chane, and all the decks on this list are capable of doing that. So let's move on to Dorinthia. A lot of people moved... Okay, wait. This is an Axe Dorinthia list. I'm sorry. I apologize, everyone. I thought I had a serious Dorinthia list. Let's see if I can bring one up. I thought I'd found one. I must have closed the wrong one. I am not looking at an Axe Dorinthia list. Go away. This is only 68 cards. Okay, maybe I need to come back to Dorinthia in the next video. I am disgusted by Axe's Dorinthia. Okay, there's nothing wrong with Axe's Dorinthia, but like, it's not her optimal list, right? Let's just see if there's one on Fab Dojo. I'm not sure there was, because I've been to a Road to Nationals where Dorinthia has won. Okay, maybe this Hayden Brown one will do us. Okay, good. Not running axes. Right, so we've got Dorinthia Ironsong basically is one of the more complicated heroes you will see because a lot of people have sort of fallen out of practice against her. And we can just use one of these lists to sort of give us an idea of... Okay, so Dorinthia's thing revolves around attacking multiple times with her weapon. So her ability is when her weapon hits, you can attack an additional time with the weapon, which normally you can't do. Dawnblade, the second time it hits every turn, gets a counter. If you're not blocking Dorinthia, she will just get a counter. Dorinthia's keyword, Reprise, is if this attack is defended with a card from hand, it gets a little bonus. Let's see if we can find one. Ironsong Response, for example. So against Dorinthia, you have two options, right? You can either play Control, where you're blocking a lot, usually her second attack, to make sure she doesn't get any counters, and trying to keep the pressure on with regular attacks with your hammer or your club. Or you can play aggro, where you don't block either attack, you let her build up tokens, but you try and get her down before it matters, or block one key turn with something like an unmovable, or a flick flack, or a sink below, and basically rip her counters off her on one big turn where you block with the defense reaction all of your hand and just say, okay, cool, I want your counters back now. And then after you've taken her counters off, you can race her. The main threats in this deck is really just the Dawnblade. The Dawnblade is going to come in against you every time. It's going to come in with things like Warrior's Valor or Singing Steelblade. Sorry, this deck list is pissing me off. Where are we? Yeah, it's going to come in with stuff like Steelblade Supremacy, which gives you +2 and draw a card if you hit. It's going to come in with Warrior's Valley that makes the weapon 6 strength. Stroke of Foresight, which gives +3. Ironsong Response, +3 if you defend from hand. Stuff like Razor Reflex to buff it more. Route to stop defending stuff. Dorinthia really is just this attack reaction focused class that really will seek to open opportunities if you defend badly, which is why I say you kind of have those two options where you either have to defend really well, where you're blocking her first attack so that she can't do a second one because her ability isn't triggered, but you kind of need to play around this notion of how much can she actually reach with based on the number of cards in her hand. A common number for Dorinthia to get is +3. So she could get +3, 9. She could get +3 up to 6 from her weapon. Or she could go even higher with an overpower or something like that and a rout. Typically, I think a safe number to try and block Dorinthia for is something like 9, and that will get a lot of her cards out of her hand. So if you block for 9 on the first attack, you may find that she doesn't actually have the resources to do a second attack. But equally, you could just save that for the second attack to stop her getting more tokens and just block the second attack with the defense reaction if it's only for 3 or for 4. And that will just slow her down a lot, especially if it's from Arsenal, because she may have played some of those attack reactions on her first attack and dealt you some damage, but ultimately the damage isn't as important as keeping control of her counters. She also has things like Glint the Quicksilver. An important thing for playing against Dorinthia, and I think this is very important, is to understand how she gets go again on her weapon. Sometimes she'll get go again on her weapon only if you block. Sometimes she'll have something like Glint the Quicksilver, where she gets go again regardless of whether or not you block. Or she'll use her Snapdragon, her Refraction Bolters. The important thing to understand, though, is that even if she gets go again on the weapon, she can't swing with the weapon a second time unless she hits you with it, because her hero ability needs to trigger. So unless the weapon hits the first time, she can't swing a second time anyway, which is why some Dorinthias do and have started running stuff like Enlightened Strike, stuff like Nourishing Emptiness, big attacks they can throw in when they have go again, but they don't have the ability to do a second attack. I think that's kind of worth remembering and understanding, that you're not just going to be facing the weapon. There will be other times where they're coming in with another threat after the weapon just because you blocked. And that's going to be like some option you have to consider. Dorinthia is one of those heroes I really feel, unlike some of the heroes, like say Bravo, I really feel like you just need to get the reps in versus a good Dorinthia player. It's really hard to understand the real threat of these attack actions until you accidentally block from hand and suddenly you're getting double irons on response and you're being hit for like 12. You know, you really have to get an understanding and an idea for how Dorinthia plays and the best way to block Dorinthia. And genuinely, I think it is one of those decks where reps and mistakes are how you really learn that, because there isn't a hard and fast rule for how to block Dorinthia's sword. Really, it is a question of, resources floating, cards in arsenal, cards in hand. What have I already seen them play this game? Do they have they played a Warrior's Valor? How many? There's a lot of little things there that you have to kind of try and read and understand. And Dorinthia really punishes you if you don't see those opportunities and if you don't follow through and block in the right way. So I think that's just worth understanding. She's not as common in the top 8 as you might think. People have gone off her a lot because it seems like she loses to Prism, and Prism was very popular for a while. But personally, I feel like she has a good matchup against a lot more of the top 8 decks you're going to run to than you think. And I have seen people have a lot of success with Dorinthia, certainly in the UK, winning a road to nationals and sort of in other tournaments coming in top 4 and things like that. I definitely feel like a Dorinthia is a contender, though I think part of that is because she isn't as popular recently. So a lot of the people who started in Monarch do not have a lot of experience. Playing against Dorinthia and blocking correctly is so important, and they won't do it, which will get them knocked out of the game in Swiss. The last hero we're going to cover in this part 1, we're going to make part 2 tomorrow, is Dash. Dash is a very interesting hero because she starts with a mechanologist item in play, which can be something like an induction chamber that gives her gun go again, or something like a Teklo core, which gives her +2 resources. And usually that's kind of what they start with. I guess there's sometimes there's another one which is like a hyperdriver or something, but that's not really that common in many decks. Usually it is just an induction chamber if they want to go for a more control game, or a Teklo core if they want to go for a more aggressive game. Though often induction chamber is the default just because it gives your weapon a bit more of an option because you can pitch a blue and shoot twice with the plasma pistol. So that really is kind of Dash's overall game plan, is to shoot you with the pistol many, many times. Though that does somewhat oversimplify things. One of the reasons that Dash is very good is the flexibility inherent in her deck that you can change based on the sideboard. So she has this pistol that she can shoot, and if she gets 2 induction chambers, she can shoot it 3 times a turn. If she gets a plasma purifier, she can give it +1. If she gets 2, she can give it +2. So then she can shoot you for 12 damage in a turn, pitching, I think it's 2 blues to do it, right? Which is quite strong. The other side of Dash's deck is all based around boosting. It's around, basically, you flip the top card of your deck when you play something like Throttle, and if you reveal a Mechanologist card, you can get Go Again. It is worth noting that boosts do miss quite often in Dash, so you may find someone boosts against you and then they don't have a follow-up, and you just kind of have a dead turn. But they do try and sort of play around that by maybe shooting the pistol a few times and then boosting. So that's just worth knowing. It's also worth knowing sort of big threats like Pedal to the Metal, where if it hits, the next attack gets Dominate. Things like High Speed Impact again, which give the next attack Dominate. Things like Combustible Courier, which you need to block completely, or they give the next attack +3. Kind of just ways to get cards out of your hand. So like, if you're going up against Dash, you're either going to go up against the Dash that's going to try and set up against you if they think you're playing a slow deck, which means they're going to play Induction Chambers. They're going to try and get 2 of them out using their Spark of Genius to search their deck for them. They're going to try and get the Plasma Purifiers, and then they're going to try and block you every turn with a defense reaction with 2 cards, spend the other 2 cards to shoot you for 12 in 3 bursts with the pistols, and basically whittle you down. The other way that Dash can go, basically, if they think you're really aggressive and they're not going to have time to set up, is just to come in with stuff like Throttle, 0 to 60, Zipper Hit with Go Again, and try and get off that maximum velocity, which is obviously a 2 for 10 if you've boosted 3 or more times, which will require their arsenal to do, probably. Then you can come in with the maximum velocity. If you're thinking that Dash is going to go for the maximum velocity build, it may be worth including Command and Conquer to target their arsenal. And how you kind of approach Dash really just depends on how you're kind of thinking that she's going to try and set up against you. Is she going to try and go more control? Do you need to pressure her before she gets her induction chambers into play, her plasma purifiers into play, so she's not shooting you for 12 a turn? If you can get her low enough that she can't keep cards in her hand, which you'll see as a theme for a lot of these games, especially if you're playing aggro decks, is to get people low enough they can't keep cards in their hand as reliably, and then they can't put the pressure on you in the way they would want. But expect Dash to be modular. Expect Dash to change against how your hero deck is set up. If you're playing control, expect to get the induction chambers, the plasma purifiers. If you're playing aggro, expect to get things like maximum velocity. Expect to get things like Throttle, 0 to 60, Zipper Hits, just coming in for 4, for 5, boosted nice and cheap. Maybe a High Speed Impact into like a really big, turn. Maybe a Combustible Courier into a really big attack. And just the pressure will be coming on from those boosted attacks. So that's kind of just worth being aware of. It's not like Dash in itself, not very intimidating. If they're going pistols, you can tell exactly how much damage they can do to you on a specific turn with a blue or 2 blues. If they have 1 pistol, an induction chamber, and a plasma purifier, it's 6. If they have 2 induction chambers and 1 plasma purifier, it's 9. If they have 2 and 2, it's 12. And really understanding that maximum limit of, if they block with 2 cards, they can only deal me 12 damage is quite important, because it guides how much you need to take. Because it can be quite awkward blocking 3s and 2s, and 4s. So you may need to not block everything and just be like, well, they can only deal me 12 damage this turn, so I need to keep that pressure on. So, for example, if you're playing something like Aggro Katsu, which obviously I've done into Dash a few times, I know if they've set up a certain way that they can only deal me 9 damage a turn. So if I'm dealing them, say, 12 or 13, and they're being forced to block with 3 cards, I know that I'm only going to take 12 damage in return. So as long as I can keep dishing out the damage and forcing them to block, I'm not actually taking that much damage back compared to what I'm dealing, and I can very much push the tempo in my direction, where that Dash player is forced to not attack me with other stuff like Zipper Hit and just forced to fire her pistol once or twice a turn, dealing me like 12 damage, and I'm just going to keep smashing in until I break through and kill. So, you know, it is being worth that. And also, if a dash takes a turn to try and set up with a Spark of Genius or a Plasma Purifier, they're not necessarily going to put any pressure on you that turn, so you really can just like go all out and try and hurt them. But it is worth noting that dash can switch between these two modes, and you might see yourself getting shot twice with a pistol and then getting a throttle and then getting the high speed impact, you know, into a dominated something or other. So it is just worth being aware of that little switch that can happen, and just trying to figure out what sort of dash game plan they're going on when you first get paired up against them. Anyway, we're at 45 minutes. I've been through 5 of the heroes. I think I've had a reasonably good summary, but I'm happy to get feedback if anyone has more questions, or if anyone would like me to dive deeper into a specific matchup or a specific hero. I probably have the capabilities to do demo games of certain matchups if people really want to see them. So let me know what your preferred matchup is, and I will dig out someone to play against me in that matchup and show you how it works and talk through it with commentary. Join me probably not tomorrow, but maybe Friday for the next part of this video, where of course we'll look at the next 5 heroes, which will be 5 decks, which will be the 2 types of Katsu, which will be, sorry, let me bring up my list. The 2 types of Katsu, Prism, Rhinar, and probably Viserai. So we'll come up against that, and yeah, we'll just keep talking about this like this. I hope you guys have found this useful. If you have, let me know. I've really been enjoying the feedback from my last video. It really made it feel worth it to do, and I'm really glad that people have sort of responded and enjoyed what I put out there. And obviously, if you did, and if you find yourself using the advice in this video, please do give me the like and subscribe. I've been completely blown away by the fact that I managed to get 70 plus subscribers from the last video. I really didn't imagine that. Obviously, you know, thanks to everyone who came to the channel and subscribed. I hope you enjoyed the content. I hope putting out more content about metas and decks that are good as I just keep playing this game and keep playing against good decks will keep you all interested. Obviously, you know, going above 300 subscribers, I didn't think would happen when I started switching from, you know, the niche board games and Lelfavar and stuff like that I was playing before into something like Flesh and Blood. And I'd absolutely be blown away if it continued and, you know, I got more followers and, you know, even to the point where I have community features and things like that. But you need to get up to 1,000 for that. So we're not going to be jumping the gun. But if I get to 500, maybe I can do a giveaway or something for everyone who I've seen, you know, follow the channel or something like that. I do have some nice things around that I could probably give away in the promo category. Yeah, and that's it, really. I mean, it's just been a very good 2 weeks of Flesh and Blood, and I've really been just appreciating going somewhere once a week and just playing this game. We drafted this evening. We got 9 people to our weekly armory, so we just drafted and had a good time. And, you know, Flesh and Blood is a really great impact on my life at the moment in terms of getting me out there and doing stuff that is fun. So recording this content is part of that, and I do just I like speaking about the game, and I like seeing how engaged people are with the stuff I put out. So feel free to get in touch and chat if you've enjoyed this video. Thanks everyone, and have a nice day.